All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome back. We're going to go over Chapter 3, British North America today. Um, Hopefully, you have already watched the lecture for Chapters 1 and 2 of Indigenous America and Colliding Cultures. So, this is Chapter 3, British North America. We're sort of entering now the phase of history that's probably going to be a little bit more familiar from high school, social studies, and whatnot. So, let's go ahead and dive into it. The key points that I have here at the beginning of every chapter. I'm not going to go over these right now. I probably won't in most of these recorded lectures because they're there for you to read in the document. So I don't want to beat a dead horse, keep going over the same things. You read these in your textbook as well. The key points are really pulled directly from your textbook. So we are going to go ahead and move on from the key points, just get straight into the lecture. This might be a slightly shorter recording today since we're only having to go over one chapter. Okay, so let's talk here about the Middle Passage and the slave trade. What we go over in the lectures might be a little bit out of order from what's in your textbook, but I feel like this is a good place to start when we're talking about British North America. You've got here the outline of the slave trade. Um, this doesn't do as good of a job as I would like it to in terms of sort of displaying this three-sided triangle that we generally look at when we're talking about the Middle Passage. But what it does show is it is an interconnected system on all three sides. You have Europe, you have the coast of Africa, and you have North America. And all three of these play together in an interconnected way that doesn't leave one out. And if we're going to use any types of moralistic terms, it doesn't leave responsibility out of anyone's hands either for the slave trade. So in Europe, there are a lot of manufactured goods being produced. Specifically in England, they have already a fairly large industrialization of their society, lots of metalworking, lots of furniture making, lots of production of various items. And these items, from what we had kind of considered trinkets today, all the way through incredibly valuable items, they're part of a trade system that leaves Europe, and here we're specifically kind of talking about Great Britain, leaves Europe and travels down to the west coast of Africa. And those are sent to Africa for the trade. And within Africa, there is an incredibly complex network that creates the system of slavery. Um, Captured Africans that are usually captured from somewhere more in the interior of Africa, they are captives of slave raids, various tribal conflicts. They're brought to the coast and they're held in these slave outposts, and they are traded by Africans to Europeans for the manufactured goods that we've talked about. So you do have a set of Africans who are perpetuating the slave trade here on the coast. They built an economy where you can exchange human goods for material goods. And once those are traded for, then European ships who have received these enslaved Africans, they send them to North America to be exchanged for raw materials. And that's kind of an important part of this entire cycle, is that the manufactured goods that are being made in Europe can only be made because there is so much natural resource wealth in North America. And so you've got this triangle that we always talk about. The raw materials going to Europe for manufacturing, the manufactured goods go to Africa to be traded for human enslaved Africans, and then those are taken to North America, and the cycle goes on and on and on again. You kind of see it a little bit better here with this illustration, probably pulled from a lot of your high school social studies textbooks, but it is sort of this very traditional way of thinking of this trade. And let me see if I can use any of these neat pens. Okay. So starting here in Great Britain, you've got the trade to the west coast of Africa, and the west coast of Africa that is most common in the slave trade. Pretty much you can think of like here to here. And these enslaved Africans taken on ships over the Atlantic, most of the time straight to the Caribbean. We're not talking about it as much in this class because the Caribbean doesn't become part of the United States, the political entity that we are today. But most of the slaves in the slave trade are going here. They're going to the Caribbean, the West Indies as they were called. That is where most of them go. Yes, a lot of them do go to North America, and then the United States very famously has a very complicated relationship with slavery all the way until the 1860s and the American Civil War. But the majority of this human trade goes from the west coast of Africa to the Caribbean here. And the systems of slavery in the Caribbean are also going to be a lot different than what you see in North America. So it is important to sort of step back for a minute and let's think about the system of slavery as not a monolith. And when I say monolith, it's considering one thing as always being that way. And the system of slavery, particularly in the 17th, 18th, 19th century, is very much not that. What type of slavery you see is going to be very dependent on geography, and we're going to get a lot more into that in the next few chapters, but know that. And then, like we mentioned, the raw materials from North America, and that's mostly timber, various kinds of metal ores and things like that. That gets transported back. Let me grab my pen. To Great Britain. It's also wrong to think that this is a solely English endeavor, a British thing. It's not. Most countries in Western Europe, particularly, are involved in some capacity in the African slave trade. So it is not a British thing. It is not solely an American thing. It was a European thing. And within North America too, yes, we do think of this part of North America as the British part, which is pretty accurate. There's a lot that is not. There's a lot of French colonies up in the north, Spanish colonies in the south, all of which utilize some system of African slavery as well. So here is a really interesting personal description of being captured as a slave in Africa. And there are understandably not a lot of these types of first-hand descriptions available for us, mostly because first-generation Africans who were born on the continent of Africa and captured and enslaved, most of the time were not allowed by their enslaver to learn English and whatnot and learn how to read and write. So having a written description like this is pretty rare. And it comes from a man named Olaudah Equiano, who was born on the continent of Africa. He has a slightly different story from a lot of his fellow Africans who go through this system, but he does eventually gain his freedom. He learns to read and write English, so he leaves us a very unique description of these types of events that we don't really get told in the human story. We know they happened. We have the results of it, so we know that. But to have it written down, to have it said by someone who is there, is always a totally different historical experience in my eyes. So let's take a look at some of the words that he left for us and give some respect to those. So again, this man's name is Olaudah Equiano, and he writes that one day, when all our people were gone out to their works as usual, and only I and my dear sister were left to mind the house, 2 men and a woman got over our walls, and in a moment seized us both, and without giving us time to cry out or make resistance, they stopped our mouths and ran off with us into the nearest wood. Here they tied our hands and continued to carry us as far as they could. Thus I continued to travel, sometimes by land, sometimes by water, through different countries and various nations in West Africa, till at the end of 6 or 7 months after I'd been kidnapped, I arrived at the seacoast. The first object which saluted my eyes when I arrived on the coast was the sea, and a slave ship which was then riding at anchor and waiting for its cargo. These filled me with astonishment, which was soon converted into terror when I was carried on board. I was immediately handled and tossed up to see if I were sound by some of the crew, and I was now persuaded that I had gotten into a world of bad spirits and that they were going to kill me. Their complexions too differing so much from ours, their long hair and the language they spoke, which was very different from any I'd ever heard, united to confirm me in this belief. Indeed, such were the horrors of my views and fears at the moment, that if 10,000 worlds had been my own, I would have freely parted with them, all to have exchanged my condition with that of the meanest slave in my own country. So it's one thing to read this. It's easy to read words, but to sit back and try to think about this experience as you, yeah, putting yourself in the shoes of, and there should be a lot in this class. When you look at history, when you look at descriptions like this, try to remove yourself from the purely academic. Try to place yourself in the experience of these people, and I think the entire experience of history will change for you. Alauda was a human being who, throughout his life, experienced all of the emotions that you've ever experienced in your life. Let's get that right. That there's no human experience, no human emotion that is 100% unique. That just has never happened. You are part of a human experience that everyone has had. And yes, you might have some unique elements to it, but not so unique that it's never happened. And to take our lives and our issues and our troubles in today's time, which aren't invalid, they're the issues of our time, but to think back on a time when this happened to a human being is it should be powerful to you. You should get something from it. This description of being ripped from your home, being forced to walk for half a year. 6 or 7 months is half a year, more than a semester of school, to a place that you've never been. You're born in the interior of Africa. You've never seen the coast. You've never seen the ocean, this unending body of water. You've never seen a boat, especially a European masted ship like that, sitting on the water. You've probably never seen someone with white complexion to their skin. You've never heard the types of languages. You have no reference for it. In many ways today, that really is like being abducted by an alien, being taken to a completely different world, almost a different dimension, especially in a time here that isn't globalized like the world that we live in today. We live in a world where the internet connects us, so we are a lot more used to different cultures and different ways of thinking and different ways that people look. But in this time, you are not. You're fairly isolated within the community that you're born in. You have no way of knowing what's beyond your own community. It's a truly terrifying thing. And this is a human being that went through that. So remember that. We'll have some more descriptions kind of about the human suffering of the slave trade, but always keep that in mind about the humanity of what we're discussing. He describes this a little bit more. He says, "Soon after this, the blacks who brought me on board went off and left me abandoned to despair. I now saw myself deprived of all chance of returning to my native country, or even the least glimpse or hope of gaining the shore, which I now considered as friendly, and I even wished for my former slavery in preference to my present situation, which was filled with horrors of every kind, still heightened by my ignorance of what I was to undergo." Here's a description from a lot later. The previous one we read was from the later parts of the 18th century. This is quite a bit later. It's really kind of past the scope of this chapter per se, but talking just about the humanity of the slave trade. Reverend Robert Walsh was a British reverend, I believe a reverend in in the Anglican Church. And he was very anti-slavery. He was involved in a lot of anti-slavery efforts. And at this time, the British had banned the slave trade. It was illegal within British territory. So they did have British naval ships that tried to suppress the slave trade. And he's part of one of these efforts. And what he describes here is a slave ship that the Royal Navy has stopped. But this is how he describes it. The circumstance which struck us most forcibly was how it was possible for such a number of human beings to exist, packed up and wedged together as tight as they could cram, in low cells 3 feet high, the greater part of which, except that immediately under the grated hatchways, was shut out from light or air. And this was when the thermometer, exposed to the open sky, was standing in the shade on our deck at 89 degrees. The space between decks was divided into 2 compartments, 3 feet 3 inches high. The size of one was 16 feet by 18, and of the other 40 by 21. Into the first were crammed the women and girls, and into the second the men and boys. 226 fellow creatures were thus thrust into one space 288 feet square, and 336 into another space 800 feet square, giving to the whole an average of 23 inches, and to each of the women not more than 13 inches. The heat of these horrid places was so great, and the odor so offensive, that it was quite impossible to enter them, even had there been room. After enjoying for a short time the unusual luxury of air, some water was brought. It was then that the extent of their suffering was exposed in a fearful manner. They all rushed like maniacs towards it. No entreaties or threats or blows could restrain them. They shrieked and struggled and fought with one another for a drop of this precious liquid, as if they grew rabid at the sight of it. It was not surprising that they should have endured much sickness and loss of life in their short passage. They had sailed from the coast of Africa on the 7th of May, and had been out but 17 days, and they had thrown overboard no less than 55, who had died of dysentery and other complaints in that space of time, though they had left the coast in good health. Many destroyed one another in the hopes of procuring room to breathe. Men strangled those next to them, and women drove nails into each other's brains. Many unfortunate creatures on other occasions took the first opportunity of leaping overboard and getting rid in this way of an intolerable life. It's a very powerful account. I recommend that you do read the rest of it. You'll see that there's a link down here if you'll go to the PDF version of these slides in Moodle. Please go do that. Show some respect to the people of the past, and go read this account. Here's an illustration of a slave ship. This was very commonly published, especially in British papers that were pushing anti-slavery efforts. And it's just a good illustration of some of what Reverend Walsh was describing about how packed in these people were. And the minds of the slave ship owners and slave ship captains, the more people you could cram in meant the more cargo, the more money you could make. So removing the humanity from it, and what we would consider today as personal space and enough space to function, that wasn't a consideration. It was simply about herding as many people into as small a space as possible to make the most amount of money. And it leads to the truly horrible, wretched, terrible conditions that you just heard about. Another illustration here, a cross cut of a slave ship. You can see that in the bottom part, they've got cargo stored, and then an upper deck where the human cargo is stored. All right, go to the PDF document, follow the link to this, and please watch this little video. I don't generally recommend History Channel stuff, but Roots and what they did with it is at the least a very good way to humanize the experience. It's different to see things visually, and I get that, and I think the History Channel did a good job with this. So please do go watch this. All right, so what are we doing talking about the English Civil War, talking about British North America? Well, it did have an impact, obviously, because it had a huge impact on the governmental styles and systems of governing in Britain that then kind of waylays over into North American politics as well. So just a little bit of background since it isn't the main focus of this class and it's a pretty complicated topic. But the origins of the Civil War, there is a lot of political and economic and religious strife in England during the 1600s. And it all comes to a head in 1640 when King Charles I asks Parliament to push through some new tax laws. He's trying to raise a little bit more money because there's a war in Scotland that he's trying to fight. And so he asks Parliament, please give me some more money through taxes. And Parliament says no. Parliament is kind of the older English and current British version of the Congress, the governmental body, legislative body. So when Parliament refuses these taxes that Charles wants, Charles disbands Parliament. This in of itself is a huge step. To place it in modern American terms, it would be like the American president not getting what they want from Congress, so they just tell Congress to go home. Go away, you're not doing your job anymore. Right, that would be like a government breaking act. And it was. The dismissal of Parliament leads to a war between the Royalists, those who support Charles I, and the Parliamentarians, who are also called the Roundheads, who support Parliament against the king. And this war lasts for about 9 years. It's a very long thing. It's very drawn out. Very, very bloody war. And here we've got a slide of the governmental structures of the American colonies. And why that is important is because it ties the colonies to the British government in different ways. So you have colonies like New Hampshire, New York, New Jersey, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia. Those are royal colonies. So the king, the monarch, has granted someone the ability to rule this land. He's gifted the land. The way a lot of early European colonization worked is if you arrived there first, you claimed everything in the name of your monarch, and then the monarch splits it up as he sees fit. And the royal colonies, they do function largely that way. The charter colonies, slightly different. Those are kind of companies, almost, yeah, almost corporations in a modern sense that went to North America, to a certain piece of land, settled it, and then got a charter from the king, who then gives them permission to set up their own government. So they're largely autonomous. They're pretty much self-governing. There's not much reporting back and forth between Great Britain and North America. They're kind of autonomous. Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, kind of important to note that a lot of those are the colonies that are more associated with this religious freedom idea of immigration. That's a bit different than some of the other places in North America. And then you have the proprietary colonies. And those are gifted to one man, one family. Maryland is gifted to the Calvert family. Um, there was a man who was Lord Calvert, a Baltimore, I believe. So yeah, at one point there was some aristocracy in the United States. Pennsylvania famously gifted to William Penn, like the man William Penn, gifted this entire huge area of land that's now Pennsylvania. And the other important part of the royal colonies that I forgot to mention, they are governed by a royal governor. So there's a very direct tie between the English government and the royal colonies, like a direct tie between them and the appointments of the royal governor. The charter colonies don't have that. They're pretty self-governing. And the proprietary colonies are also largely self-governing because they've been gifted away to someone else who does the governing by themselves and aren't really beholden per se to the English government. Now, the reason I've gone over the different governmental types of the American colonies at the time was because it tended to influence which side of the Civil War the colonies ended up on. The North American colonies are not ignorant of what's going on. For most of them, they're first generation immigrants from England to North America. So they know what's going on. They know a lot of the underlying issues about what caused it. But depending on how the government of the colony is run, kind of tended to sway them towards one side or the other, supporting the traditional government type with the monarch or supporting this new English republic. And all of them were outwardly neutral for a long time, that they didn't really want anything to do with it, because for the most part, if you immigrated to North America, you were doing it to get away from the political issues in England. You really didn't want anything to do with it. And that sort of went across the board, regardless of whether you were in the New England colonies that were there more for the religious freedom ideology of the Puritans and the Pilgrims, or if you're maybe Virginia or Southern that's there for a more economically related reason, you still really don't want to be part of this. But big event in 1649, Charles I, King of England, is executed by Parliament, and that changes the entire game. And that caused some of the colonies, most notably Virginia, to declare allegiance to Charles II. So he's the son of Charles I, and by declaring allegiance to him, you're declaring allegiance to the royalists, not the actual governing body of the time, which is Parliament. They've executed the king, they've taken control, and at this point, a man named Oliver Cromwell has installed himself as what he calls the Lord Protector of England. And one of the consequences of the colonies starting to outwardly take sides in the conflict is that Oliver Cromwell, who held the reins of power in England, he starts to tighten English control of the overseas colonies. And that's an important step because up to this point, not much of it had really been governed by any type of central governmental authority in England. A lot of the governments in North America had been pretty much left alone to do as they pleased. And it's here in 1650 that, because specifically Virginia taking the side of the Royalists, Oliver Cromwell decides he needs to start taking some more control over what's actually going on over there. So in 1650, he passes an embargo act to punish the colonies for taking the side of the Royalists. And an embargo act is typically an economic function. You're trying to stop trade, and stopping trade going in hurts the economy there, hurts the consumers there, the population there. It's a way to influence opinion. If you suddenly don't have access to the goods that you want or you need, sometimes it can change your mind. Sometimes it's just a punishment. And in 1650, this embargo act mostly functions as a punishment. And in 1651, the Navigation Act is passed. And this 1651 Navigation Act is the beginning of a really important economic system that ties England to its North American colonies. And in essence, it forces its overseas colonies to ship all of its goods directly to England and only in English ships. So that obviously has a massive impact on international trade for the colonies. They are now no longer legally allowed to send their raw goods to France, to Spain, to the Dutch, to any other European port. If it was a good produced in North America, it had to go to England, and then English merchants could trade with it as they will. So it severely restricts the ability to make your own economic decisions in North America. And it is a system called mercantilism that you probably read about, maybe passing through in high school. But it's that system of mercantilism and this harsh English control of your economic freedom that is going to be one of the catalysts towards future revolution, the American Revolution. It's one of those underlying currents that's always there in the American and British relationship. And the following monarchs who return, Charles II, he comes back out of exile, defeats the parliamentarians, and he becomes king again. And the monarchs who succeed him, James II and William and Mary, they continue that trend that started with Oliver Cromwell of tightening economic control because they see profit there and an economic advantage to the natural resources in North America. So once governmental control was started, it just continued. And why that's so important, the Navigation Act of 1651, subsequent legislation, that kickstarted the economic system of mercantilism, like we said. And disputes over the system, kind of almost a bitterness about it, that restriction of freedom would be one of the major catalysts that leads to independence in the 18th century. Okay, so this recording is already getting a little bit longer than I expected, so I am going to skip over a lot of these slides about various Native American wars. I'm going to skip to the end, to a thing called Bacon's Rebellion. Go look at the slides in the PDF document. They're all covered in the textbook as well. You should be good with them. They are a very interesting topic. But go ahead, use those resources for them, and I'm going to skip ahead to one more thing before we end this recording. Okay, this is what I wanted to talk a little bit about. Bacon's Rebellion. Funny name, but it's actually named for a man with the last name of Bacon. Nathaniel Bacon. He wanted the governor of Virginia at the time, William Berkeley, to drive Native Americans out of the colonies. So why he wanted to do that? A lot of background information there that we just don't have time to go into, but in essence, this is about land grabbing, which is going to be a very common theme in early American history. Nathaniel Bacon and a lot of other Virginian landowners saw the existence of these Native American groups on the outskirts of the colony as competition for land. So this kind of goes back to our first lecture where we talked about the differences in ideas about land ownership between Native Americans and Europeans, and they just don't jive very well. Native Americans tend to be on the side that you can't own the earth and attribute some supernatural powers to the earth itself and whatnot. And Europeans are of the mindset that one man can legally own one patch of land, defend that land, use it as he sees fit, etc. And the landowners of Virginia, to put it in the simplest way possible, want more land. And the way to do that is to drive Native Americans who are occupying that land currently out. And the group that forms behind Nathaniel Bacon, importantly to this story, is a very diverse group. It is not just rich white landowners. It is poor white landowners. At this time, there still have yet to be passed a lot of slave laws that are going to really solidify the way we see American slavery in the South later in the 19th century. There's a good population of free blacks in Virginia as well, and they support this too. That they want land just as much as the poor whites want land, just as much as the rich whites want land. And they form an opposition to William Berkeley, who is the royal governor of Virginia. They chase Berkeley out of the capital, which was Jamestown. They burn the town to the ground, and this is one of the first instances of organized rebellion, organized resistance in American history. It's kind of interesting and coincidental. It happens in 1676, 100 years before the very, very famous date of 1776. But Bacon, in the course of this little rebellion, if you can call it that, he dies in 1677, and the rebellion kind of dies out. The royal government takes back over, and 23 leaders of this little rebellion are captured and arrested and executed. But what comes out of this that is important is this document that they wrote called the Declaration of Grievances from 1676. And a lot of historians will point out similarities here between this idea of coming together as an oppositional group and writing a document that lays out your grievances, why you are opposing the sitting government, and putting that forward as an explanation for their actions, because that's what we do later on in 1776 with the Declaration of Independence. We all know the first few words, right, from Thomas Jefferson, but most of that document is just a long list of how the British colonists felt that King George III had treated them poorly. And you kind of see that here in this Declaration of Grievances from 100 years before. There's a little quote here from it. "For having protected, favored, and emboldened the Indians against His Majesty's loyal subjects, never contriving, requiring, or appointing any due or proper means of satisfaction for their many invasions, robberies, and murders committed upon us." So they are claiming that the royal governor, William Berkeley, hasn't been doing his job. He hasn't been protecting the borders. There have been Indian attacks and whatnot. Whether or not that's sort of a specious claim in terms of their underlying motive of wanting more land, there sure was a lot of border violence too. But this is just kind of an example. They write down this list of things that they find wrong with William Berkeley's governance as an explanation for why they had the right to rise up in rebellion. So, as mentioned, this was the first instance of organized rebellion against the colonial government. But something you really need to take away from it in terms of long-term impact is this involved a really disparate group of people that included indentured servants who tended to be white Europeans and free Africans. And the combination of those two things really broke into the social consciousness of the colonial upper class in a pretty big way. It intimidated them in a lot of ways because it showed that the lower spectrum of the social classes could come together on an issue, and they tended to outnumber the elites pretty heavily. And when you give power to those groups of people, then it's harder to maintain your own power over them. And because of that, it behooved the colonial elite to start instituting these various slave codes. We'll talk a bit more in our next lecture about this, about the racialization of slavery, because for all of human history there have been slaves, right? But the racialization of it is something that kind of happens in North America, where it's confining slavery and the idea of slavery to a specific race of people, and that's for a very specific reason. It separates out the black and white, regardless of social class. So it makes it much harder for something like this to happen, where poor whites and poor free blacks can come together on an issue. If you racialize it to a point where you associate one class of people with one thing and separate them, it is easier to maintain power over those separated groups of people. So in 1705, as one of the reactions to this rebellion, the Virginia slave codes are passed, and they are intended to segregate the poor whites from enslaved Africans. So it consolidates that conception of race-based slavery. It had a lot of restrictions, like slaves couldn't travel with weapons without written permission. Whites could never be employed by blacks, even free blacks. So you're racializing society. You don't only have social stratification, but you have racial stratification. And regardless of your economic class, it places one race above the other race in society. So that is going to be the end of this lecture. Hope you got something out of it. The Native American Wars, please go back into the slides document PDF in Moodle, and I will talk to you next time.